In the early 17th century, during the Dutch Golden Age, c. 1588 to 1672, Amsterdam became a center of global trade. Ships brought goods from Asia and the Americas, and the economy flourished thanks to the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. Trade shaped life. Merchants calculated profits. Children learned to estimate the prices of spices and fabrics. Herring, fabrics, and coins were sold in markets. Exchange rates were discussed in taverns. Tulips arrived in the Netherlands in the late 16th century. The first bulbs were brought from the Ottoman Empire around 1554 to 1593 by diplomats and the botanist Carolus Clusius, who planted them in Leiden in 1593 to 94. Initially, they were a rarity for the nobility, a status symbol like an exotic flower with bright, colorful petals. Viral mosaics created unique patterns. By the 1630s, the fashion had spread. Rare varieties like Semper Augustus, only 12 bulbs were available in the 1620s, fetched thousands of guilders. Owning tulips became a marker of wealth, on par with owning a house on the canal. The market evolved. At first, actual bulbs were traded in the summer, but from 1634, futures contracts emerged, trading in windhandel, promises of a future harvest. Speculation intensified in 1636. Prices soared, with a rare bulb reaching 4,000 to 5,500 guilders, 10 to 20 times the annual income of a craftsman, approximately 300 to 500 guilders per year. Some transactions included exchanges for houses or land. The peak occurred in the winter of 1636-1637. The crash occurred in February 1637. Prices fell by 90 to 99%. Contracts became worthless, and many people lost their fortunes. This became the first documented speculative bubble in history, where a common flower became the object of financial frenzy amid prosperity and a willingness to take risks. With the rise of tulip interest in the Netherlands from 1634 to 1636, the market evolved from trading actual bulbs to trading promises. People began entering into written agreements. The buyer would agree to purchase a bulb of a rare variety after the harvest, usually in summer, at a fixed price agreed upon in advance. These agreements gradually became a separate trade. The contract could be resold to a third party before the actual delivery of the bulb, often at a profit if prices rose. Thus, futures trading was born, the first documented futures contracts in history, which the Dutch called windhandel, wind trading, since the bulbs never changed hands and the transactions were concluded on paper. The principle was simple. Person A would make an agreement with person B. In a few months, I'll buy a Semper Augustus bulb from you for 2,000 guilders. This was recorded in writing. Then, seeing demand increase, A would resell the agreement to person B for 3,000 or 4,000 guilders, rather than the actual bulb. This market was very different from today's. There was no centralized exchange with clearinghouses and strict rules. Transactions were concluded in taverns, guilds, or private homes, often beginning verbally and only later being notarized. Participants included not only professionals, but also artisans, innkeepers, even peasants, anyone attracted by quick profits. Trade was conducted primarily in the rights to future bulbs, especially in the winter of 1636 to 1637, when the plants were still in the ground. Some contracts were resold up to 5 to 10 times a day. Prices depended less and less on the actual value of the flower, the cost of care and rarity, and more on the expectation that someone will pay even more later. By mid-1636, the atmosphere in Amsterdam had changed. The same canals reflected the masts of ships, the same taverns filled with smoke and conversation, but the topics had shifted. At one table, merchants were still arguing over the price of pepper from India or cloth from England, while at the next, Artisans were excitedly discussing how the rare Viceroy variety had doubled in price in just one winter. Stories of easy riches began circulating around the city. A baker from Harlem, they said, bought a couple of onions at a fair, then sold them a season later for 3 times the price and immediately paid off his bakery debt. Another innkeeper allegedly exchanged one right to a Semper Augustus onion for a new house by the canal. These stories passed from table to table, growing ever more vivid. Someone allegedly bought a carriage, another paid for his daughter's dowry in a single transaction. The circle of participants expanded. While rare tulips had previously been the preserve of botanists, wealthy collectors, and professional gardeners, now a whole new breed of people were entering the game. Craftsmen, shopkeepers, innkeepers, those who had previously traded in bread, beer, or leather, suddenly decided to give it a try. In one family, a carpenter returning from the tavern announced to his wife, "Everyone invests, and we're no worse off." The wife countered,
"That's money for a rainy day."
but the husband was certain.
Not taking advantage of such a chance would be foolish.
He took the 300 guilders he'd set aside and purchased the rights to 2 bulbs of a rare variety, which were to be dug up in the summer. In the evenings, groups would gather in taverns and guilds. People would take out small sheets of paper, one with a description of the variety, the price, the delivery date, and the signatures of witnesses. These papers would pass from hand to hand. One would ask,
"But you don't have the bulb right now, do you?"
and receive the answer,
"But I have the right to have it, and the right can be sold for more than yesterday."
At first, such notes served merely as confirmation of an agreement, but soon they became a commodity in their own right. They were bought and resold several times in an evening. Someone began chalking the prices of popular varieties on the wall of a tavern. The figures grew imperceptibly but inexorably. If the previous year's Admiral de Liefken cost 1,000 guilders, now it was 2,000, 2,500. Instead of anxiety, excitement filled the voices. Just a little more, and it will be 3 times that. An old gardener who had loved tulips for their beauty all his life once remarked,
"You've completely stopped talking about flowers, only about price."
A young merchant replied,
Beauty in itself is worth nothing if you can't make money from it.
So little by little, the expectation of profit completely supplanted interest in the plant itself. By the end of 1636, the tulip had become firmly entrenched in Amsterdam's urban culture. At markets, vendors offered not only bulbs, but also drawings of rare varieties and engravings of colorful buds. In the taverns, humorous songs were heard about those who bought too late or sold too early. In their homes, families discussed new tulip prices as often as news of the war with Spain or new trade routes to Asia. The psychological effect was powerful. It seemed everyone was involved. A young apprentice from the workshop, with little understanding of contracts, thought, "If even the shop owner has invested his savings in tulips, how can I remain uninvolved?" One evening, hesitantly, he signed the purchase agreement. He looked around. Dozens of people were already making deals, laughing, clapping each other on the back. Doubts dissipated. Amid the general excitement, the first skeptical voices appeared. An old notary who had seen many trade cycles warned at the table,
The price of these papers rests only in the belief that another buyer will be found.
His words were met with sneers.
You just don't understand modern times. The market will sort everything out.
But warning signs were already flickering. Someone couldn't immediately find a buyer for their obligation. The deal was delayed. The counterparty asked to wait a week or 2. These incidents were drowned out by the general hubbub of euphoria. Late in the evening, in a tavern, a table was littered with signed documents. People were arguing, laughing, raising glasses to future profits. No one yet knew that very soon these papers would no longer be worth even the ink they were written with. In early February 1637, the evening began as usual in an Amsterdam tavern. People were gathering to resell tulip contracts, but tension was already in the air. Someone was whispering, "The prices aren't right today." One merchant tried to unload the rights to a rare variety at the previous day's price of 4,500 guilders, and for the first time he found no buyer. The answer was,
Too expensive. I'll wait. Maybe it'll fall.
this became the breaking point. Several people simultaneously decided to get rid of the papers, fearing a halt in growth. One sharply lowered the price by 30%, if only they'd take it. Others followed. Confidence vanished. The chain, held together by faith in the next buyer, began to crumble. The collapse occurred rapidly. In a matter of days, prices plummeted by 90 to 95%. On the walls of the tavern, people crossed out yesterday's figures and hastily wrote new ones, 3 to 5 times lower. Faces expressed a mixture of surprise and fear. Just yesterday, everyone had believed in endless growth. Now they were ready to sell at any price. They argued, "It's just rumors. Someone deliberately brought it down. The authorities must intervene." The clash with reality came in the summer when the gardeners dug up bulbs under old contracts. One of them brought bags, but the buyers, obligated by the papers, refused to pay. A real flower, yesterday worth thousands, now barely found a market for tens of guilders. Disputants gathered in guilds and at notaries' offices. Some demanded that the contracts be fulfilled. Others called them a game and asked for them to be annulled. In the end, many transactions were declared invalid to protect ordinary artisans from ruin. Personal tragedies were severe. The carpenter who had invested his savings for a rainy day lost everything. At home, his wife counted the remaining coins, barely enough for food and rent. The children felt the tension without understanding the reasons. For wealthy merchants, the collapse meant the loss of part of their fortunes. They kept their homes and ships. For the poor, it was a catastrophe. Deaths, property sales, workshop closures, and the inability to marry off their daughters. After the crash of February 1637, the mass craze quickly cooled. At Amsterdam markets, tulips were now spoken of with bitterness and anger. Some laughed at their own naivety, others accused their neighbors of spreading rumors, and still others vowed never to deal with papers again. Chalk price lists for rare varieties disappeared from taverns. In their place appeared the usual advertisements for grain for sale, warehouse rentals, or jobs sought. Experienced merchants began to analyze what had happened. In one conversation, an old merchant remarked, "The problem wasn't the tulips, but human greed and the belief in endless growth." His interlocutor added, "The flowers will remain, but people will now be more wary of paper promises. Wealth that exists only in words is too fragile." In the spring of 1637, tulips bloomed in the garden of one of the former speculators. They retained their former beauty, bright petals, strict forms, but there was no crowd of buyers around. The owner looked at them with a new expression, no longer a source of quick wealth, but a reminder of how far imagination, tied to money, can lead. Tulip Mania became the first mass experiment in trading the future, the prototype of futures contracts. People paid a high price for this lesson. At its peak, a single bulb could cost up to 10 times the annual wages of a craftsman, and after the crash, just a few guilders. The camera rises above Amsterdam. Canals, houses, ships. The trading republic weathered the storm and continued to thrive. Bubbles burst, flowers fade, but the desire to get rich quick always returns. Only the names of the markets and the objects we are willing to turn into gold change.